When basketball legend Michael Jordan stepped into a quiet Chicago diner seeking a moment of peace after a hectic charity event, he never expected to come face to face with his past. There, wiping down tables with arthritic hands, was 85-year-old coach Thomas Wilson, the man who had once bandaged his scraped knees, taught him the fundamentals of basketball, and nurtured his earliest dreams of NBA stardom. Shocked to find his beloved childhood coach still working two physically demanding jobs just to survive, Michael was confronted with a stark reality. While he had become one of the wealthiest athletes in the world, the man who helped shape his competitive spirit had been struggling in obscurity for decades. What begins as a chance reunion quickly unfolds into an extraordinary journey of redemption, revelation, and an ambitious plan that will change both their lives forever. Because what Michael doesn't yet realize is that hidden beneath this seemingly simple story of reconnection lies a long-buried secret, one that will force him to question everything he thought he knew about his past and the very foundations of his success. Michael Jordan rubbed his tired eyes as he slipped out the back door of the Chicago Convention Center. The charity basketball event had been a blur of handshakes, cameras, and questions about his business empire. Now all he wanted was a moment of quiet before his driver arrived. "Just 15 minutes," he muttered to his security team. "I need coffee." His bodyguard nodded, scanning the street before pointing to a small diner across the road. "That place looks empty enough, sir." The diner was indeed quiet, just what Michael needed. The smell of fresh coffee and home-style cooking filled the air as he stepped inside. He ordered a black coffee and found a corner booth away from the windows. From this spot, he could see the entire diner. That's when he noticed him. An elderly black man in a faded blue uniform slowly wiping down tables. Something about the careful way he moved caught Michael's attention. His silver hair was closely cropped, and despite his hunched shoulders, he worked with purpose. Michael sipped his coffee, unable to look away. There was something familiar about his hands, the way his right wrist rotated slightly as he scrubbed a stubborn spot. Couldn't be Coach Wilson. The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. The old man didn't hear him. He continued his work, moving slowly to the next table. "Coach Thomas Wilson?" he asked louder this time. The man turned, confusion crossing his weathered face. "Yes? Do I know you, sir?" Michael stood up, his heart pounding. His security guard raised an eyebrow, but Michael waved him back. Up close, he could see the deep lines around Coach Wilson's eyes and mouth. His hands were spotted with age and rough from work, but those eyes, those keen, observant eyes, were exactly the same. "It's me," he said softly. "Michael. Michael Jordan from North Carolina." Coach Wilson's eyes widened. The cleaning rag dropped from his hand and fell to the floor. "Little MJ?" he whispered, using the nickname only he had ever called him. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of touching Michael's face. "My little MJ, is it really you?" Michael nodded, suddenly finding it hard to speak. This man had taught him how to dribble, had pushed him to make the varsity team when others thought he wasn't ready, had told him that height wasn't as important as heart. "You grew up so tall," Coach Wilson said, his voice still carrying that distinctive Carolina drawl after all these years. "I see you on the television sometimes. Championships and sneakers and businesses." He smiled proudly, "Just like you always said you would." "What are you doing here, Coach?" Michael asked, glancing around the nearly empty diner. "You must be 85 now. Last month," he finished for him, bending slowly to pick up his rag. Michael bent down quickly to help him. "But why are you working at a diner?" The question came out more bluntly than he intended. Coach Wilson straightened his uniform, his pride visible in the way he lifted his chin. "Life happens, son. I work because I must. The bills don't pay themselves." A loud voice called from behind the counter. "Wilson, tables 4 and 6 need clearing." "One moment, Mr. Davis," he called back, his voice suddenly sounding tired. "You should sit down," Michael said, noticing how he leaned slightly on the table for support. Coach Wilson shook his head. No time for sitting, MJ. Besides, these old bones keep moving or they stop altogether. He smiled, but Michael could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Can we talk after your shift? Maybe, Michael asked. Coach Wilson checked the large clock on the wall. I finish at 8. Then I catch the bus to my night job. Night job? Michael couldn't hide his shock. You work 2 jobs? Coach Wilson nodded matter-of-factly. Night security at the high school over on Washington Street. It pays better than daytime work. Michael ran a hand over his shaved head, struggling to process what he was hearing. The man who had once taught him that determination beats talent when talent doesn't work hard was spending his nights patrolling school hallways. Coach, I want to. Wilson, those tables. The manager's voice cut through their conversation again. I have to go, Coach Wilson said, giving Michael's arm a quick squeeze. You look good, son. Your mother would be proud. Before Michael could say anything else, he shuffled away, picking up dirty dishes as he went. Michael watched him work, noticing how he winced slightly when lifting a heavy tray. His security guard approached. Sir, your car is waiting. Michael nodded, unable to take his eyes off Coach Wilson, who was already busy with another table, his back to him now. He pulled out his wallet and left a $500 bill under his coffee cup. Felt pathetically inadequate. We need to change plans, he told his guard. I want to know everything about this diner, who owns it, shift schedules, everything. And I need to know where he lives. The guard nodded, already making notes on his phone. Michael took one last look at Coach Wilson, the man who had once been the center of his childhood world, now invisible to everyone except his hands that cleaned their messes. As he walked out into the busy Chicago street, the contrast was dizzying. His car waited sleek, expensive, comfortable. His phone buzzed with messages from people who wanted his time, his money, his ideas. And behind him was Coach Wilson, still working at 85, his hands red from hot water and chemicals. This isn't right, he whispered, sliding into the back seat of his car. As his driver pulled away from the curb, Michael made a decision. The man who had once taken care of him would never have to clean another table or worry about bus schedules again. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he would make sure of it. What he didn't realize was that helping Coach Wilson would uncover a long-buried secret, one that would change everything he thought he knew about his past and force him to question the very foundation of his success. Back in his penthouse suite overlooking the Chicago skyline, Michael paced the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights sparkled below, but he barely noticed them. His mind was in another place, another time. Coach Wilson, he whispered, the name unlocking a flood of memories he hadn't visited in decades. He dropped onto the edge of the king-sized bed and closed his eyes. Suddenly, he was 10 years old again, standing in the doorway of the community center in North Carolina, watching a younger Coach Wilson demonstrate the perfect jump shot form to a group of boys. This is Coach Wilson, his mother had said. He's going to help you improve your game. Young Michael had studied him curiously. Coach Wilson wasn't like the other coaches who yelled and pushed. Instead, he knelt down to Michael's level and asked, Do you love the game, son? Really love it? When Michael nodded, he had smiled. Good, because if you love something enough, you'll work harder at it than anyone else. And that's when magic happens. Michael opened his eyes and reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He found the number for his private investigator. I need information on someone, he said when the man answered. Tonight. After the call, Michael walked to the minibar but didn't open it. Instead, he stood still, remembering the challenges of his early teenage years. He'd been cut from the varsity basketball team, the most painful rejection of his young life. His father's voice had been disappointed, his mother's encouragement well-meaning but ineffective. Through it all, Coach Wilson had been steady. When Michael hid in the gym, practicing shot after shot through his tears, Coach Wilson brought him water without making him talk. When he couldn't sleep because of his fear of failure, Coach taught him to visualize success. "See the ball going through the net," he would say, mimicking the perfect arc with his hand. "When you feel lost, this motion will help you find your way." Michael walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, looking at his reflection. He could almost see the skinny boy he'd been, the one who got cut from the team for being too short, for not being good enough. "You have a special kind of hunger," Coach Wilson had told him once after he stayed 3 hours after practice. "They might not see it now, but someday they'll wish they had believed in you." He had taught Michael more than basketball fundamentals. Not just shooting and dribbling, but how to think around problems. When his shots missed, Coach never said he was doing it wrong. Instead, he asked, "What can we learn from this miss?" Michael's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from his assistant. "Found address for T. Wilson. Also, your meeting with Nike moved to 10 a.m. tomorrow." He sent a quick thank you and went back to the window. Down below, the city was alive with people heading home or out for the night. Was Coach Wilson on a bus somewhere in that sea of lights, heading to patrol empty hallways while everyone else slept? The memory that hit him next was painful. He'd been 17 years old, coming home from winning the state championship, excited to tell Coach Wilson about the college scouts who had approached him. But when he burst through the door of the community center, Coach Wilson wasn't there to greet him. "Where's Coach?" he had asked the director. He had to leave, Michael. The director's voice had been strange, tight. "When is he coming back?" "He's not coming back. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone." For weeks, he had waited by the phone, sure Coach would call to congratulate him. His mother finally told him to stop. "It's complicated adult business, Michael." He had never understood what that meant. In his college and early NBA years, he'd sometimes imagine he saw Coach on the street or in a crowd at games. But eventually, like all childhood things, Coach Wilson faded into the background of his memory. Until today, Michael's laptop chimed with an incoming email. The subject line read, "Preliminary info on T. Wilson." He clicked it open. There wasn't much yet, just basic details. Thomas Wilson, age 85, retired from the North Carolina school system 20 years ago, moved to Chicago 15 years ago. Current address: an apartment in a rundown part of the South Side. 2 jobs: diner worker during the day, school security at night. No criminal record. Small bank account. No retirement fund. "How is this possible?" Michael muttered. Another memory surfaced. Coach Wilson teaching him to control his temper on the court, to channel his competitive fire productively. "Basketball is like life, MJ," he had explained. "You can't control the ref's calls, only your response to them. The things we cannot control can still be used to our advantage." Later, when Michael built his first winning streak in the NBA, he had used that exact mindset with his Bulls teammates. His phone rang. It was his private investigator. "Mr. Jordan, I found something interesting." T. Wilson worked for several schools in North Carolina over the years before coming to Chicago. He was employed at your middle school and community center from 1985 to 1992. "Yes, I know that part," Michael said impatiently. "What's unusual is how his employment ended. There's no record of him quitting or being formally terminated. He simply disappears from the school records. Then, 3 weeks later, he appears in Chicago applying for a job at a youth center." Michael frowned. "That doesn't make sense. He loved that job. Those kids." "It gets stranger," the investigator continued. "There was an internal investigation at the school around that time, something about funding irregularities for the basketball program. But the files were sealed, and then the whole thing just disappeared." After hanging up, Michael lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Why would Coach Wilson leave so suddenly without saying goodbye? The school had never given him a straight answer about it. Now he wondered if there was more to the story than complicated adult business. He closed his eyes again, and this time he remembered something else the last time he had seen Coach Wilson. The night before he disappeared, Michael had been in the gym practicing late. He heard raised voices from the school office. Coach Wilson's voice, not calm and measured as it normally was, but fierce and protective. "You cannot treat these boys this way," he had said. "They are children, not commodities." The principal had replied something Michael couldn't make out, and then Coach Wilson had said, "Then perhaps you should be the one to leave." The next day, he was gone. Michael sat up, the memory sharp and clear now. Had Coach Wilson been fired for standing up to the principal? For defending the players? And if that was true, what else about his childhood had he misunderstood? He picked up his phone again, this time calling his mother in North Carolina. "Mom," he said when she answered, "I need to ask you about Coach Wilson." The long silence that followed told him there was indeed a story here, one he was only beginning to uncover. "Mom," Michael repeated into the phone. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," his mother finally answered, her voice unusually cautious. "Why are you asking about Coach Wilson after all these years?" "Because I just saw him today in Chicago. An 85-year-old man clearing tables and working night security to make ends meet." A sharp intake of breath came through the phone. "How is that possible?" "Mom, what happened back then? Why did he really leave?" "Michael, it's very late here. Can we talk about this another time?" "No," he said firmly. "I need to know now." His mother sighed. "Some things are better left in the past." "Not this," Michael insisted. "Not him." "I'll call you tomorrow," his mother said, and the line went dead. Michael stared at his phone in frustration. Even after all these years, people were protecting secrets. But whose? And why? While Michael was winning his first NBA championship in 1991, Coach Wilson was working as a youth counselor at a Chicago community center. His days started at 5 a.m. and often didn't end until midnight. He slept in a small apartment above the center and had Sundays off if another volunteer could cover. The year Michael signed his first major endorsement deal with Nike and became a global icon, Coach Wilson was learning that his brother Gerald had cancer. He moved to a cheaper apartment to help pay for Gerald's treatments, working nights as a security guard so he could take Gerald to doctors during the day. When Michael's dream team was winning Olympic gold in Barcelona, Coach Wilson was burying his brother and facing eviction from the small apartment they had shared. The rent had increased, and he couldn't afford it on his own. As Michael's first signature Air Jordan shoes flew off the shelves worldwide, Coach Wilson was standing in line at a free clinic, hoping the pain in his knees was just arthritis and not something worse. The doctor told him to find less physically demanding work. He smiled politely and went straight to his security job. Two paths that had once crossed now ran parallel, never touching, separated by vast canyons of circumstance. If the story moved you, remember the mentors who shaped you. Call them, thank them, or be one for someone else. The greatest legacies aren't built on trophies and championships, but on the lives we touch and the wisdom we pass forward.